In the winter of 1944, a Dutch mother named Johanna van den Berg made a decision that would save her 4 children. The Nazi occupation had seized everything. Potatoes gone, wheat gone, livestock slaughtered and shipped to Germany. The official ration had dropped to 500 calories per day, half what a child needs to survive. 22,000 Dutch citizens would die that winter. They called it the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. But Johanna's children survived, not because of government rations, not because of black market food, because Johanna remembered something her grandmother had taught her. 8 plants. Wild plants, forgotten plants, crops that the Nazis couldn't find because they didn't know to look for them. Crops that grew in ditches, in abandoned lots, in places no army would think to search. She dug frozen tubers from the earth with her bare hands. She stripped bark from trees for flour. She harvested seeds that most people thought were weeds. Her children ate what their great-grandparents had eaten, and they lived. After the war, Johanna tried to tell people. She wrote 2 newspapers. She spoke at community meetings. "Grow these crops," she said. "Remember them. The next famine could come at any time." Nobody listened. The Marshall Plan arrived. American wheat flooded Europe. Supermarkets opened. Refrigerated trucks connected farms to cities. The old crops, the survival crops, the foods that had kept people alive through the darkest winter in European history, were dismissed as primitive, peasant food, fit only for animals and the desperately poor. Within 1 generation, the knowledge was nearly gone. Johanna van den Berg died in 1987. Her grandchildren had never tasted the foods that saved their parents' lives. They did not know the names of the plants. They did not know how to find them. They only knew the supermarket. But the plants did not disappear. They still grow in ditches, in forgotten fields, in the margins of a world that has forgotten how fragile food systems really are. And the 8 crops that saved Johanna's children are the same 8 crops I am about to show you. Welcome to Nature's Lost Vault. Today, we're opening the file on the crops that won World War II, not wheat, not corn, not the grains that fill history books. The secret crops, the survival crops, the foods that feed people when everything else has failed. If this knowledge matters to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every like and share preserves what they try to erase. The vault is open. The first crop Johanna dug from frozen ground was not a vegetable her grandchildren would recognize. It was Jerusalem artichoke, Helianthus tuberosus, the sunflower root. When French explorer Samuel de Champlain landed on the coast of Massachusetts in 1605, the Algonquin people served him a feast. Among the dishes was a knobby root they called kishak panak, the sun root. Champlain wrote in his journal that it rivaled the finest artichokes of Europe. He filled his ship with tubers and sailed home. Within 50 years, Jerusalem artichokes grew in gardens across France, Italy, and Germany. The plant spread because it could not be stopped. Unlike potatoes, Jerusalem artichokes are perennial. Plant them once, and they return every year without replanting. The tubers multiply underground like a network of buried treasure. 1 plant becomes 10, 10 becomes 100. Leave them alone for a decade, and you have a field of food that appeared from nowhere. The yields astounded European farmers, 15 to 20 tons per acre, more than potatoes, more than any root crop they had grown before. But the Jerusalem artichoke had problems. The tubers were knobby and difficult to clean. They caused gas in people who weren't accustomed to eating them. They spread aggressively, appearing in places they weren't planted. By the 1700s, the potato had won. Larger, smoother, easier to harvest. The Jerusalem artichoke became animal feed, food for the poor, and eventually forgotten entirely. Then came the war. In 1940, Nazi forces occupied the Netherlands. They implemented a policy called the Hunger Plan. Food would be systematically stripped from occupied territories to feed the German war machine. Local populations would survive on whatever remained. What remained was almost nothing. But Jerusalem artichokes grew wild in Dutch fields, in ditches along roads, in abandoned gardens where they had spread unchecked for decades. The Nazis didn't recognize them. They didn't know to seize them. The knobby roots that European agriculture had dismissed as worthless became the difference between life and death. A 1946 study by the Dutch Agricultural Research Institute documented what survivors already knew. Families with access to Jerusalem artichokes showed significantly lower mortality rates during the hunger winter. The forgotten root had saved lives. Here's what makes Jerusalem artichokes so remarkable. They survive temperatures to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The tubers wait underground, frozen solid, until someone digs them up. They need no fertilizer because their roots reach deep into the subsoil, pulling up minerals that other crops can't access. They need no pesticides because almost nothing bothers them, and they cannot be destroyed. Burn a field of Jerusalem artichokes, and they grow back from root fragments. Plow them under, and they return stronger. Bomb them, and they survive beneath the soil, waiting. This is why military planners notice them. In a prolonged conflict, crops that can be destroyed are strategic vulnerabilities. Crops that cannot be destroyed are insurance. After the war ended, something strange happened. The Dutch government did not promote Jerusalem artichokes. Agricultural extension services did not teach farmers to grow them. Seed companies did not sell tubers. The crop that had saved thousands of lives simply vanished from official agriculture. Why? Because Jerusalem artichokes cannot be controlled. They spread without permission. They replant themselves forever. You buy tubers once, and you never need to buy them again. The seed industry that emerged after World War II was built on annual crops. Corn that must be replanted every year, wheat that must be purchased every season. Crops that create customers, not self-sufficient farmers. A plant that makes farmers independent is not a product, it's a threat. Today, Jerusalem artichokes are classified as invasive in parts of Europe. Invasive. The word we use for plants that succeed without permission, plants that feed people, whether corporations profit or not. Johanna van den Berg's grandchildren can find them growing wild throughout the Netherlands, but they would not recognize them. They have been taught to see weeds where their grandmother saw survival. The second crop Johanna harvested that winter was even more controversial. It was a plant that governments had spent decades trying to eradicate. A plant so productive, so versatile, so impossible to control that it threatened entire industries. Stinging nettle, Rutabagas. The name alone makes people flinch. Stinging, the tiny hairs on nettle leaves inject formic acid into skin, causing a burning rash that lasts for hours. Every child in Europe learns to avoid nettles. They grow in waste places, in abandoned lots, in corners of gardens where no one tends. But here's what most people never learn. Stinging nettle is one of the most nutritious plants on earth. The leaves contain more protein than any common vegetable. 30% protein by dry weight, more than spinach, more than kale, more than any leafy green sold in supermarkets. They contain more iron than beef, more calcium than milk, more vitamin A than carrots. A complete nutritional profile that rivals or exceeds the most expensive health foods, and the sting disappears completely when the leaves are cooked. Boil nettles for 30 seconds and they become a mild, slightly sweet green vegetable that tastes like spinach crossed with cucumber. European peasants knew this for centuries. In Scotland, nettle pudding was a traditional spring dish. In Germany, nettle soup sustained poor families through lean winters. In Scandinavia, nettle bread was baked when wheat ran short. But nettles have another property that made them strategically important during World War II. The stems contained fibers stronger than cotton, finer than linen, more durable than almost any plant material known. During World War I, Germany faced a cotton blockade. Uniforms were wearing out faster than they could be replaced. German scientists turned to nettle fiber. By 1917, nettle collection was mandatory in occupied territories. Millions of pounds of wild nettles were harvested to make military textiles. The fabric worked. German soldiers wore nettle uniforms when cotton was unavailable. The fiber held up to combat conditions that would have shredded lesser materials. When World War II began, both sides remembered. Britain launched a nettle collection campaign in 1942. Posters urged civilians to gather wild nettles for the war effort. Schools organized nettle harvesting trips. The plants that children had been taught to avoid became patriotic duty to collect. But the true value of nettles wasn't fiber, it was food. In occupied Europe, calories were currency. The Nazi hunger plan was designed to starve subjugated populations while feeding German soldiers. Rations dropped below survival levels. People ate whatever they could find. Nettles grow everywhere humans have disturbed the soil, along roadsides, around bombed buildings. In the rubble of destroyed cities, they thrive on nitrogen-rich soil, which means they flourish exactly where other crops have been harvested or destroyed. They cannot be eradicated because they spread through both seeds and underground rhizomes. Pull up a nettle patch, and it returns within weeks. Spray it with herbicides, and resistant plants survive to spread further. Johanna van den Berg harvested nettles throughout the hunger winter. She knew to wear thick gloves. She knew to cook them thoroughly. Her children ate nettle soup 3 times a week when there was nothing else. The nutritional density kept them from developing the deficiency diseases that killed other children. The iron prevented anemia. The protein maintained muscle mass. The vitamins that most people could only get from vegetables they could no longer afford came free from plants growing wild in ditches. After the war, nettles returned to their status as weeds. No agricultural university taught farmers to cultivate them. No food company processed them into products. No government promoted them as a nutritional resource. Why would they? Nettles cannot be owned. They grow without permission, without purchase, without any commercial transaction. The fiber industry had moved to synthetic materials that could be patented and controlled. The food industry had no interest in products that people could gather for free. Today, stinging nettles grow in every temperate country on Earth. They are classified as noxious weeds in many jurisdictions. Property owners are sometimes legally required to remove them. But in health food stores, dried nettle supplements sell for $30 per pound. Nettle tea is marketed as a premium herbal remedy. The plant that governments once urged citizens to collect is now a boutique product sold at specialty prices. Johanna's grandchildren could harvest nettles for free from any abandoned lot in their neighborhood. But they have been taught that weeds are worthless. They buy supplements instead. The third crop on Johanna's survival list was not a plant at all. It was a tree. A tree that once covered eastern North America in forests so vast that Europeans could not comprehend them. American chestnut, Castanea dentata. Before 1900, the American chestnut was the most important tree on the continent. 4 billion trees stretched from Maine to Georgia, from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. In some forests, 1 out of every 4 trees was a chestnut. The trees were massive, 100 feet tall, with trunks so wide that hollow chestnuts were used as houses. A single tree could produce over 100 pounds of nuts in a good year. And those nuts were not ordinary nuts. Chestnuts contain more starch than any other nut. They can be ground into flour and baked into bread. They can be roasted and eaten like potatoes. They can be dried and stored for years without refrigeration. The calorie density approaches grain, 300 calories per cup. But unlike grain, chestnuts come from trees that need no plowing, no planting, no annual labor. A mature chestnut feeds a family for generations. Native Americans called the chestnut the bread tree. They built entire food systems around the annual nut harvest. Villages were located near chestnut groves. The fall harvest was the single most important food event of the year. European settlers recognized the value immediately. Appalachian families fed their hogs on chestnuts. The pigs roamed free through chestnut forests, fattening on fallen nuts. No purchased feed required. The resulting pork was rich with chestnut flavor, unlike anything modern consumers have tasted. Poor families gathered chestnuts and sold them in cities. The nut harvest was a cash crop for people who owned nothing except the baskets they carried. Then, in 1904, a fungus arrived, Cryphonectria parasitica, chestnut blight, accidentally imported from Asia on Japanese chestnut trees planted in New York. The blight spread with terrifying speed, 50 million acres per decade. Within 40 years, 4 billion American chestnut trees were dead or dying. The greatest arboreal catastrophe in recorded history. The ecological devastation was immense. Animals that depended on chestnuts faced sudden food shortages. The passenger pigeon, already declining, lost one of its primary food sources. Some scientists believe that chestnut blight contributed to the pigeon's final extinction. The human cost was equally severe. Appalachian communities that had survived on chestnut harvests for generations suddenly had nothing. The hogs could not be fed. The cash crop vanished. Poverty that persists to this day in some mountain communities traces directly to the loss of the chestnut. But the tree did not go completely extinct. Chestnuts survive by sprouting from roots even when the trunk is killed by blight. Across the former range of the American chestnut, root systems survive. They send up shoots that grow for a few years until the blight finds them again. Then the trunk dies and the roots sprout again. The trees are waiting, underground, still alive after a century of disease. And during World War II, European chestnuts fed millions. The European chestnut, Castanea sativa, is resistant to the American blight. It survived and continued producing throughout the war. Italian peasants ground chestnuts into flour when wheat was unavailable. French resistance fighters carried roasted chestnuts as survival rations. The bread tree of Europe became the bread tree of wartime. Johanna van den Berg did not have access to chestnut trees in the Netherlands, but she knew families in southern Europe who survived on little else. After the war, she told her children, "If you can plant a chestnut, plant a chestnut. It will feed your grandchildren." Today, a century after the blight arrived, scientists are close to restoring the American chestnut. Researchers at the State University of New York have developed a blight-resistant American chestnut through genetic modification. A single gene from wheat allows the tree to neutralize the fungal toxin. The modified trees are nearly identical to the original American chestnut. With one crucial addition, they survive. If approved for release, these trees could restore 4 billion chestnuts to North American forests. The bread tree could return, but approval has stalled for over a decade. Why the timber industry has no interest in chestnut restoration? The trees were never commercially important for lumber. They cannot be patented because the genetic modification technique is in the public domain. There is no profit motive powerful enough to push approval through regulatory obstacles. So the 4 billion trees remain dead. The bread tree remains a memory. And the roots keep sprouting, waiting for a cure that sits in university laboratories. The fourth crop that kept occupied Europe alive has been almost completely erased from American memory. Mangle worzle, Beta vulgaris. The name sounds like something from a fairy tale. It translates from German as root of scarcity, the beet that grows when nothing else will. Mangle worzles are not the small red beets sold in supermarkets. They are massive roots, 15 to 20 pounds each, bred specifically for bulk production. Delicious. The flavor is earthy and bland, nothing like the sweet beets bred for human consumption. But they are dense with calories and nutrients, and they grow in conditions that would kill more delicate crops. Mangles tolerate poor soil, cold temperatures, and minimal water. They can be planted late in the season when other crops have failed. They store so long that roots harvested in October can be eaten in April. During World War II, Mangle worzles became human food across occupied Europe. The Nazi occupation prioritized potato seizure because potatoes were recognized as human food. Mangles were classified as animal feed and often overlooked. Farmers who grew mangles for their livestock quietly ate them instead. The roots can be grated and made into pancakes. They can be boiled and mashed, like potatoes. They can be sliced thin and fried until crispy. None of these preparations are gourmet. All of them sustain life. In Britain, where Nazi occupation never came, but food shortages were severe, the government launched a campaign to grow mangles in every available space. Victory gardens planted mangles alongside carrots and cabbages. The homely root vegetable became patriotic duty. Johanna van den Berg grew mangles in her backyard before the war. She had intended them for a neighbor's pig. When the pig was slaughtered and seized, the mangles became human food. Her children complained about the taste. They ate them anyway. Survival has no room for preferences. After the war, Mangle worzles disappeared from European agriculture almost completely. The reason was simple economics. As livestock farming industrialized, animals were moved into confinement operations and fed grain-based commercial feed. Farmers no longer needed to grow their own fodder. Mangle production required labor that industrial agriculture could not justify. Today, finding Mangle worzle seeds requires searching specialty heirloom suppliers. Most garden centers have never heard of them. The root of scarcity has become so scarce that it has nearly vanished. But the seeds still exist, and the plants still grow. I planted Mangle worzles for the first time 2 years ago. The seeds cost $3. The harvest filled a wheelbarrow with roots that will keep in my basement until spring. If everything else fails, I can eat beet pancakes until the garden produces again. That's insurance. That's what the World War II generation understood. You grow food that keeps you alive when the food you prefer is unavailable. The fifth crop on the survival list was perhaps the most controversial of all, a crop so threatening to corporate interests that the United States government made it illegal for 40 years. Hemp cannabis, sativa. Before you dismiss this as drug advocacy, understand something crucial. Hemp and marijuana are the same species, but fundamentally different plants. Hemp contains almost no THC, the psychoactive compound that makes marijuana intoxicating. You could smoke an entire field of hemp and experience nothing except a headache. But hemp was banned along with marijuana in 1937, and the reasons had nothing to do with public health. Hemp is the oldest cultivated fiber crop on Earth. Archaeologists have found hemp fabric dating to 8000 BCE. Chinese emperors wore hemp robes. Egyptian pharaohs were buried in hemp shrouds. The word canvas derives from cannabis because canvas was made from hemp. The crop arrived in North America with the first colonists. The Virginia Assembly required every farmer to grow hemp in 1619. It was legal tender in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson grew hemp at Monticello. The Declaration of Independence was drafted on hemp paper. For 3 centuries, hemp was among America's most important crops. The fiber made rope, sails, and clothing. The seeds provided oil for lamps and nutrition for humans and livestock. The herds, the woody core of the stem, made paper and building materials. Then, in the 1930s, everything changed. William Randolph Hearst owned vast timber holdings that supplied his newspaper empire. Hemp paper threatened those holdings. A newly invented machine called the decorticator made hemp processing vastly more efficient. Popular Mechanics magazine called hemp the new billion-dollar crop in 1938. DuPont had just patented nylon, a synthetic fiber that would compete with hemp textiles. Nylon was profitable only if natural fibers were unavailable or expensive. Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury and DuPont's primary banker, appointed his nephew-in-law Harry Anslinger to head the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger launched a propaganda campaign linking hemp to violence, insanity, and Mexican immigrants. He called it marijuana to obscure its connection to the hemp that Americans knew and used. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 effectively banned all cannabis cultivation. Farmers who had grown hemp for generations were suddenly criminals. Then, World War II began. Japan seized the Philippines, cutting off America's supply of Manila hemp for naval rope. Suddenly, the crop that had been demonized as a dangerous drug was desperately needed for the war effort. The government performed an astonishing reversal. In 1942, the USDA produced a film called Hemp for Victory. The narrator urged patriotic farmers to grow hemp for military use. Over 400,000 acres were planted. The government distributed seeds and registration licenses to farmers who had been told just 5 years earlier that hemp was a menace to society. The film was shown to farmers across the nation. It explained planting techniques, harvesting methods, and processing procedures. It was official government propaganda promoting the exact crop the government had banned. After the war, something even more remarkable happened. The government denied the film existed. For 30 years, the USDA claimed no such film had ever been produced. Researchers who requested copies were told no records existed. It was not until 1989 that copies were rediscovered, and the government was forced to acknowledge what it had done. Why deny the film? Because admitting hemp's military importance undermined the justification for keeping it illegal. Because the industries that benefited from hemp prohibition, timber, cotton, synthetic fibers, petrochemicals, had no interest in competition from a plant anyone could grow. Hemp remained illegal until 2018, when the Farm Bill finally legalized industrial cultivation. 81 years of prohibition for a crop that George Washington considered essential to American agriculture. Johanna van den Berg did not grow hemp in the Netherlands, but she knew families who did. In occupied territories, hemp was sometimes overlooked by Nazi forces because it did not obviously resemble food. The seeds are highly nutritious, containing complete protein and essential fatty acids. They were eaten when nothing else was available. Today, hemp is experiencing a renaissance. But the plant that anyone can grow from seed is being captured by corporations that seek to control it through patents, licensing, and genetic modification. The billion-dollar crop is becoming a billion-dollar industry controlled by the same interests that kept it illegal for 8 decades. The 6th crop on the survival list grows so fast it frightens people. Lamsquarter's Chenopodium album, gardeners call it a weed. They pull it from vegetable beds and throw it in compost. They spray it with herbicides. They curse it for appearing wherever soil is disturbed. But lamb's quarters was cultivated as a food crop for 4,000 years before Europeans arrived in North America. Native Americans grew it alongside corn, beans, and squash. The Navajo called it vegetable gold. The seeds were ground into flour. The leaves were eaten as greens. The plant provided food through summer and stored food through winter. Then European colonizers arrived with their own crops: wheat, barley, vegetables from the Old World. Lamb's quarters was dismissed as primitive. Native food systems were disrupted and destroyed. The crop that had fed people for millennia became an unwanted weed. But lamb's quarters refused to disappear. The plant produces up to 75,000 seeds from a single specimen. Those seeds remain viable in soil for 40 years. Disturb the earth anywhere lamb's quarters has grown in the past 4 decades, and it will appear within weeks. This is not a bug, this is a feature. Lamb's quarters is a survival crop precisely because it cannot be eradicated. It appears without planting, it grows without care, it produces food, whether humans want it or not. The nutritional profile is remarkable. The leaves contain more protein than spinach, more calcium than cabbage, more iron than most cultivated greens, more vitamin A than carrots. The seeds contain up to 16% protein and can be cooked like grain. During World War II, lamb's quarters grew in the rubble of bombed cities. Berlin, Dresden, London, Rotterdam, wherever buildings fell, lamb's quarters appeared in the disturbed soil. People who knew what they were looking at harvested greens from the same streets where bombs had fallen. Johanna Vandenberg taught her children to recognize lamb's quarters before they could read. The plant with the diamond-shaped leaves and white powder on the undersides, the weed that nobody wanted and everybody could eat. After the war, agricultural science worked to eliminate lamb's quarters from crop fields. Herbicides were developed specifically to kill it. Cultivation practices were refined to prevent it. Extension services trained farmers to recognize and destroy it. No effort was made to develop it as a food crop. Why? The same answer as every other forgotten crop. Lamb's quarters cannot be controlled. It cannot be patented. It cannot be sold because it gives itself away for free. Today, lamb's quarters grows in every American state. It appears in gardens, in vacant lots, in cracks in sidewalks. Most people spray it with Roundup. Some people eat it. I let lamb's quarters grow in my garden. I harvest the young leaves for salads. I let some plants go to seed and collect the grain. It costs nothing. It requires nothing. It produces food that would cost $10 per pound if sold in a farmer's market, but no farmer's market sells it, because why would anyone buy what grows free everywhere? The 7th crop has been reduced to a punchline: Rutabaga brassicanapus. In America, rutabagas are a joke, an ugly vegetable that nobody wants. The thing your grandmother served at Thanksgiving that everyone avoided. In Europe, rutabagas are a trauma. The winter of 1916-1917 in Germany is called the turnip winter winter. The potato harvest had failed. The Allied blockade had cut off food imports. The only food available in sufficient quantities was rutabagas. Germans ate rutabagas for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Rutabaga soup, rutabaga bread, rutabaga coffee, made from roasted rutabaga that tasted nothing like coffee. Rutabaga everything. Approximately 700,000 German civilians died from starvation and malnutrition that winter. The survivors never forgot. When the Nazis came to power, they weaponized this memory. Germany would never face a turnip winter again. Other nations would face it instead. During World War II, rutabagas were systematically sent to occupied territories as relief food. Populations that had once eaten well were forced to survive on a vegetable associated with starvation and defeat. It was deliberate psychological warfare. The rutabaga became a symbol of humiliation. Johanna Vandenberg's children were fed rutabaga rations during the occupation. They developed the same hatred that German children had developed a generation earlier. The vegetable that kept them alive was also the vegetable that represented everything they had lost. After the war, rutabagas virtually disappeared from European cuisine. The French would not eat them. The Dutch would not eat them. The Belgians would not eat them. An entire generation associated the vegetable with Nazi occupation. But here's what the trauma obscured. Rutabagas are extraordinarily nutritious. High in vitamin C, which prevents scurvy. High in fiber, which maintains digestive health. High in antioxidants, which prevents cellular damage. They grow in cold climates, that would kill more tender crops. They store for months without refrigeration. They can be planted in midsummer and harvested after frost, filling a gap when other vegetables are unavailable, and they produce heavily. A small garden plot can yield hundreds of pounds of rutabagas with minimal effort. The plant that represents humiliation is also the plant that prevents starvation. This is the psychological trap that industrial food systems exploit. We are taught to despise the foods that sustain us. We are taught to crave the foods that cannot sustain us. Rutabagas are boring. Fast food is exciting. One keeps you alive. One makes corporations wealthy. I grow rutabagas. My neighbors think I'm eccentric. I think I'll have food when the supply chain breaks. The eighth and final crop is one that almost nobody in the modern world has eaten. Yet it was once as common as bread, hardtack. Hardtack is not a plant. It's a product made from the simplest possible ingredients: flour, water, and sometimes salt, baked until completely dry, stored indefinitely without refrigeration. Roman legions carried it. Medieval sailors survived on it. Civil War soldiers cursed it. World War I troops ate it. The biscuits are nearly indestructible. Specimens from the 1860s exist in museums, still intact after 160 years. Properly made hardtack does not spoil because there is nothing in it that can spoil. No moisture, no fat, no ingredients that bacteria can consume. The taste is not the point. The taste is terrible. Soldiers called it worm castles because weevils inevitably infested long-stored supplies. They called it sheet iron because it could break teeth. But hardtack kept armies alive. When supply lines failed, when fresh food was unavailable, when everything else had run out, hardtack remained. Soldiers would soak it in water or coffee until it softened enough to eat. Some fried it in bacon grease. Some crumbled it into soup. The British Army issued hardtack as emergency rations throughout World War II. Lifeboats carried it. Survival kits included it. The knowledge that food existed which would never spoil provided psychological comfort as much as nutritional value. Johanna van den Berg did not have hardtack during the hunger winter, but she made something similar. When flour was available, she baked flat cakes at low temperature until they were completely dry. She stored them in tins and rationed them through the worst weeks. The cakes tasted like sawdust. They kept her children from starving. After the war, hardtack disappeared from civilian life. Why would anyone eat survival food when supermarkets offered infinite variety? Why would anyone prepare for scarcity when abundance seemed permanent? But abundance is not permanent. The World War II generation knew this. They had lived through scarcity. They had eaten rutabagas and nettles and hardtack because there was nothing else. Their children forgot. Their grandchildren never knew. And today, the average American household has less than 1 week of food storage. The average supermarket has 3 days of inventory on its shelves. We are one disruption from hunger, one crisis from empty shelves, one disaster from learning the hard way why our great-grandparents knew how to make hardtack. These are the 8 crops that survived World War II. Jerusalem artichoke, the root that cannot be destroyed. Stinging nettle, the weed more nutritious than any vegetable. American chestnut, the bread tree waiting underground for restoration. Mangle wurzel, the root of scarcity that feeds when nothing else will. Hemp, the billion-dollar crop banned for 80 years. Lamb's quarters, the weed that gives itself away for free. Rutabaga, the vegetable that represents both trauma and survival. And hardtack, the bread that never dies. Every single one of these crops was systematically erased from mainstream agriculture after the war ended. Not because they failed, because they succeeded too well, because they made people independent, because you cannot sell seeds to farmers who never need to buy seeds again. The pattern is always the same. Crops that empower people are buried. Crops that create dependency are promoted. Foods that grow free are called weeds. Foods that cost money are called nutrition. Johanna van den Berg understood something that industrial food systems work hard to make us forget. The most valuable foods are the ones that do not need to be purchased. The most secure food supply is the one that cannot be controlled by anyone except the person who grows it. Her children survived the hunger winter because she knew 8 plants that most people had forgotten. Her grandchildren have forgotten what she knew. They trust supermarkets that could be empty in 3 days. But the plants have not forgotten. Jerusalem artichokes still grow wild in ditches across the Netherlands. Stinging nettles still flourish in abandoned lots. Lamb's quarters still appears wherever soil is disturbed. The crops that saved millions of lives are still waiting for hands willing to harvest them. The next crisis is not a question of if, it is a question of when. When it comes to kinds of people will exist, those who trusted systems that failed them, and those who remembered what their great-grandparents knew. The seeds are still available. The knowledge is still accessible. The choice to prepare is still possible. Johanna van den Berg's gift to her children was not wealth or possessions, it was knowledge. The names of 8 plants, the places they grow, the ways to prepare them. That knowledge is now yours. If this vault opens something for you, subscribe to Nature's Lost Vault and hit the bell. Every like and share preserves what they tried to erase. The next vault opens soon.